Hi, and welcome back to Why We Are Christians. I'm here with Laur, and we are continuing on his life journey. If you haven't, please catch the first episode, and you can kind of get a first glimpse of getting to know Carl. And now we're continuing on, and we are starting back when you were in California.
Probably in my early 20s, yeah.
And you've just acquired a place to live.
Right.
And a new roommate. Tell us about your roommate.
Yeah, this fella Dean, he was quite a rascal. He could do backflips because he was a Hollywood stuntman, wannabe kind of guy. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we would stop at red lights. He'd get out of his Dodge Dart and do a backflip on the pavement, and the kids next door in the car next door would scream. And we used to go down to Laguna Beach and play Frisbee. And he knew all the best places to go. He'd cultivate friends in different housing complexes. So he'd take me to one for the best sauna and then one for the best swimming pool. Oh. And he was really...
So he was a good person
he
to
knew
know.
his way around. But he took me to Calvary Chapel. We would hang around with folks at Calvary Chapel. And I had a reference because my grandmother had taken me to church, and then I'd had the experience in the Catholic Church. This church in Southern California was quite a bit different than anything Catholic. It was much more informal in the Catholic pews that I remembered when I was little.
Right.
But Maranatha music and Calvary Chapel, and it was I didn't immerse myself in there, but I was exposed to it, and it struck a bell in me. It was familiar, It was something like it was good to hear about Jesus. It was good to hear about Jesus and sing praise. I was exposed to some scripture. Now, one of the things that I had vowed to myself before my mother died, and while I was right out of high school, and I was a student in college in Michigan, before I really moved lock, stock, and barrel to California, I was going to read the Bible. I don't know where that came from, but I figured, it's only that thick, right? And I could read it someday. I wanted to be able to say I'd read the Bible, and I had this paperback Bible that I could check off little boxes because I had a year-long reading plan in the back. So you'd read a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and I was reading the Bible. I kind of knew about Jesus. Did
you get through the Bible?
I did.
You did?
I did. With that reading plan,
wow.
I can say that I've read every single word of the Bible.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and some parts are pretty dull. Mm-hmm. Some parts are very exciting, but some parts, you have to have a stick-to-itiveness, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But it served me well, and then I had a good seed planted in me. That's one way to say it. I mean, you don't have to be anything but human to understand that if you plant something, you're going to reap the harvest of what you plant. And I had good seed planted in me from my grandmother, mm-hmm. who took me to church, from my own God above seed of saying, read the Bible, and this is important. I wanted to say this in this show. I early on, and it was right in this time frame of my mid-20s, I early on had the notion that, this English translation of the Bible is not like the original language. I mean, you just can't argue with that. It's been translated. It's been mm-hmm. translated in many different translations. I hear that a lot of time from friends of mine who say those Christians don't even know what they're talking about. They can't even make up their own mind what's the right translation. I've come around in my reading and study of what God's Word is about. I've come around to some very quiet and wonderful satisfaction on that story. But the important thing is, some 40 years ago, when I was in my mid-20s, I was wondering about this question, and I just had the strong impression that God would take care of me. That if something had been translated incorrectly, that God would have for me the truth that He wanted me to have. And I didn't have to worry about this stuff. I mean, and that just took a load off the table, I made my own roadblocks. In Revelation, I wanted to mention this because Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Do you know? Mm-hmm. Do you know, I stand I stand and knock on the door of your heart, of your life. And if you will just open the door, I will come in and we will have supper. We will feed together. We will have fellowship.
When you read that, did you know that you had felt that or you had heard the knock?
Well, I took another backpacking trip and I went by myself up in Michigan, and there was thunder and lightning. There was even a bat came out of the roof and flew around in the night over my head in my sleeping bag, and I only took the book of Revelation to read. And for those who may not know what that is about, it's got a lot of scary imagery in it. It's really dragons and fire and trumpets and heads rolling, and it's it's like wow. But I don't know. When I read that particular phrase the first time I read the Bible, I know it didn't mean as much to me then as it does now. But I mention it because it's kind of setting aside the objections you have before you've even looked at what it's about. I like to think that people might benefit someday from hearing me, that I could give somebody a boost, because I'm saying, honestly consider who Jesus said he was. Honestly consider what he said, not what I say, not what Laur says Jesus is or should be to you, but not what a church says. What does Jesus himself say? And that's what's found in what we call the special revelation, or the Word of God.
So it's the what if? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. That was monumental for me. What if he is who he says he is? As simple as that. So it's not for me, it wasn't this, I believe, struck by lightning kind of thing.
What if you don't?
It was an honest,
Right.
It was an honest question.
So anybody can ask that, you're saying, even if
I would recommend it.
You don't believe. It's a question that anybody can consider.
Yeah, you can read about contempt prior to investigation. We have that in so many things in our life, that divides us rather than unifies us. But when it's keeping you from looking at what God has written just for you, that's something I would hope and pray that people viewing this program, not only this episode, but others that we've done, might be able to, if only for a day, a week, a month, just overcome long enough to read a little bit about what God says. I mean, it says in the very first opening part, read the Gospel of John. It says, in the beginning was the Word. We know that to be Jesus. That's how we perceive what that means, the Word of God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Wow. Wow.
Some of that might be a little overwhelming for someone that's never read the Bible.
Absolutely true. Yeah, it's overwhelming for me, even now. And forever shall be.
I want to learn more about after you were attending that church for a while, and you integrated into getting to know some of the people there. I know did you have anyone that you particularly bonded with there, or were you passing through?
That's a good phrase. It really was kind of a sampling, kind of an exposure, kind of a passing through a Christian environment. Mm-hmm. I heard of house gatherings and different things that I may have gone to had I been more invited, but we somehow never managed to go there. But I went to a few services. I met the son of the founder, and I learned about Maranatha music, and I was exposed. I took a trip back to Michigan.
Why did you go home?
Wanted to go see my family, go home for Christmas. I'll be home for Christmas. And I stayed there a while. I think I went to Mass a couple of times. My mother had remarried. I lived there a short time. And then my mother passed. That was really traumatic. My sister was only 16, and my mother was only 45 years of age when she died. I was in my early 20s, 23.
That's very young.
Yeah. And so actually that was in 1976, because I'd left Michigan and gone hiking in the mountains again. I guess I really was looking in a lot of places. but I went back. I was in Glacier National Park, grizzly bear tracks in the mud of the trail I'm walking on, and you know, it was a bold adventure. And but when I wound up in Seattle, I called home, and I found my mother was in the hospital, and she never came out of the coma she was in. So I immediately returned home, of course, and then I lingered through about 8 months, and then returned to California after I had my youngest brother and my sister settled with their godparents.
So you stayed to take care of some of the things there, and how did you?
I remember at my
how
uncle's.
did you manage during
I
that
remember
time?
at my mother's wake at my uncle's house, the Catholic priest smoking cigar and drinking whiskey, and I was going like, oh, this is so weird.
Wow.
But just today, Katrina, I was listening to Alan Watts on the radio, on Pacifica Radio, talking about, how as you get older you should be honored, and there's so many things that are weird in what other people do and the cultures and the social structure around us. I don't deny people that have good ideas, but I want to share with them the good idea, which, we call that the gospel, the good news of Christ. And so I engage. I don't retreat from or avoid. I engage.
Are you talking about now? Not at that time you were...
Well, I think even at that time I was journalistically inclined. And finally, I wound up and got a degree in journalism as a journalism emphasis, and worked for radio for a little while, had some things published here and there. But my inquisitiveness is more than just working as a reporter for a news outlet. My inquisitiveness led me to the good book of God, and I think it's a real hardship as we get older that we don't want to pick up something so radically new. It's a real, we feel that we've made such progress in plotting the course of our lives that we don't want to turn in a completely different direction. And sometimes that steers us away from looking where we should look. I stand at the door and knock, says Jesus. All you do but open that door. And he doesn't impose himself. He waits for us to be receptive and to turn in that direction. That's so simple. That is so, turn towards God. Like a sunflower follows the sun across the sky. Turn your face to the light. Truly.
Is that what you've done?
I think over the course of my life I have, but there have been a lot of detours because I was off by myself because of and I don't know. I don't need to psychoanalyze myself. I don't need to comment on the fracturing or dissolution of American society.
No, but you say now you feel the sun.
Now I feel in God's pocket. Yeah, and I've meditated on it. There's one phrase in Spanish I wanted to share with you. Yo doy todos mis días a Dios.
You give all your days to God?
I give all my days to God. Yeah, and in the Spanish, yo doy is like a double emphasis. I do this, which to me is at once comical because God has given all my days to me first. He knit me together in my mother's womb. He wrote my name in his book from the foundation of the world. I thrilled to that.
So when did this like change for you? When do you feel like you really like found him or in you? Because at that church and then the time with your mother, and I'm sure that was difficult, and I don't know if that brought any question or that brought you closer.
I was drinking heavily, and I was very despondent about my mother's early death. And I realized it was one of those points in my life where I was either going to die just like my mother, or I was going to do maybe something that I couldn't perceive. And by God's grace, I did do something different, and I found a way to stop drinking alcohol in such a pattern, one day at a time. And God led me to shelter and to a safe place.
So you alcohol put you in a tough spot? Is that?
Well,
What happened?
there's a phrase that people use, and it doesn't have to be alcohol. It can be finances, it can be love relationships, it can be children, it can be aggravation, it can be
Sure.
so many things can cause you to hit your bottom. You're just depleted. There's nothing left. And I found myself at that place, and not, I don't know.
You found that you habitually were drinking more than you wanted to. Do you think that it was in your blood to do that, or it was just something you were searching for and gave you comfort?
My mother died. My mother died of alcohol poisoning.
So it was,
and my dad.
in your blood, possibly to.
Well, in the genetic disposition of how this body processes alcohol, and that's not. I'm not. It's not a rare.
No,
it's not a rare gene pool.
A lot of people reach out to alcohol for for that
comfort.
to fill, right? So that's why I'm asking you about it, because I know
This
that's
is only water.
That's not vodka. So I know that's one thing that people can identify with. Is
I had to like the story of the prodigal in the Bible. He hit a bottom. The prodigal son was given his inheritance. He went off. He lived it up. He did well, but he found himself feeding the pigs. That was what, and for a Jewish person, feeding the pigs as a daily routine is not somewhere you want to be. So he finally said, "Why don't I turn back to my father's house?" Not knowing what he would find. There's a lot around that, the wisdom of this basic instruction book for life on earth, something I heard on the radio once, the Bible. There's so much wisdom in the accumulated human saga, let alone the divinity that can be found here. But just the struggle to make it as a human being, to live to a ripe old age and have a grandchild, that's not an easy accomplishment.
So just as you're sharing your story and hoping that somebody might find similarities, when you read the Bible, you're saying you found some stories that were similar or familiar to you. There were lots of characters, lots of stories, and different kinds of experiences and people that are told about in the Bible, and you found several.
It began to make sense to me personally.
Yeah.
And not that I saw myself as the prodigal necessarily when I was going through the experience of that, but in being able, through a power greater than myself, not to have a drink every day, that gave me, it kind of erased all the scribbling on the blackboard of my thought patterns and gave me a fresh start, where the Bible and God and things I could be receptive to that. And fortunately, within right at the same time frame, I became acquainted. I was hired to do some handyman work at a local church. There came a Christmas break where the regular person was not going to be there to answer the phones, so they asked me if I'd do it for 2 weeks, part-time, at a local, regular, just
Is it a church that you attended?
Home-style church. Well, I worked, that's the point. I worked there first.
Right. So they just hired you in. You weren't part of the...
I was hanging around, but I was, you can come and go in the church on Sunday mornings and not be all that involved. But because I'd worked on the pastor's house and because I'd worked on the playground, physically putting things together, I was making... and like I'd done with the Catholic priest on occasion, I went to the pastor and I said, "Explain this to me." And of course they're human beings. They can only say, "Keep coming back," or, read the Gospel of John, or pray. Nobody can really tell you what your relationship with God is. That's a very personal thing. It's a very personal thing. But I was hired on at this church. And when I say hired on, I was brought in just temporary, but I knew nothing about the Windows operating system or computers. I didn't know the little X would turn our screen off, and I was doing like churchy work, trying to make a bulletin or do things. I just found my way. I self-taught my way into working the office equipment. Essentially, I became the church secretary. The pastor, he wanted to put on a card for me, pastor of administration. His wife was the graphic artist, and it just came back church secretary. But that was marvelous. And I want to talk about my baptism, because and this goes to the heart of the matter. No matter who you are, no matter what your age, no matter where you come from or where you're going, what you've accomplished or what you thought you should have done, God will meet you right where you are. And I was putting in the bulletin every week this little essay the pastor had written about baptism and about being baptized, what it meant. Mm-hmm. And I was reading that, and I was listening to the sermons. I listened to them all week because I made cassette duplications of them. So I would listen to the sermon 12 times as I made 12 cassette tapes. And I was sinking in. And I was seeing people that I admired within the congregation that I admired, that were my age or older, that were accomplished, that had families, that seemed to be, that owned homes in Marin County. I mean, I admired people that were suddenly sending in the form across my desk to say, I want to be baptized. I always assumed everybody was way ahead of me, that everybody was already baptized, that everybody knew a lot more about the Bible than I did, that people, it was, you could almost think it was like too late to be a Christian, as crazy as that sounds, or to follow Jesus Christ is a more appropriate way to say it. To follow Jesus Christ.
Hadn't you been baptized already in the Catholic Church?
I had been, and I didn't know what it meant, except that my mother desperately wanted to have it done, and I was not. In that tumultuous time of our father leaving and us moving in with the aunts, and I'm a little boy and changing schools, and I was not to protest anything. I was just to stand there and do what needed to be done.
So this one was maybe more intentional. You were called. You wanted to do it again.
And I'll speak to that because, and I'll put it in a nutshell. What it was for me, I would encourage anyone to look into it for themselves and counsel with someone or talk to somebody about it. But for me, it finally just came down to stop arguing about it or deciding whether I was already baptized or not, because that occurred to me, just like the Bible is maybe translated and it's not, this kind of spurious idea had occurred to me, and I kind of hid under that for a while. But God put me at that desk, and with these other people coming in to be baptized, I finally filled out the form myself and was baptized here in a hot tub in Marin County. Full immersion, dunked under the water and raised up again. And I finally did that because that's what Jesus said to do. That's all. He said to do that. And I did that.
How was that?
It was wonderful. But the heavens didn't open. But there was somebody there, a friend of mine, who immediately took me to that same afternoon took me to a far different spiritual place here in Marin County. And there was some chanting and dancing in a spiral. And, God watches over his children. He protects and saves them from, there are times I would have been murdered physically, spiritually, came real close to it emotionally. But God was always there. In my darkest hour, when I called out, there would be that thin thread of connectedness. That's really through Jesus Christ, I am connected in the Spirit with God the Father. That's the Trinity right there. And my brain, I often say, is that God's inspiration or is that Carl's imagination? Because my imagination goes a lot of places,
This is okay.
And it's amusing, I think. God loves to laugh with his kids too, just like he'd laugh with a youngster. That relationship, that connection is there. And I am profoundly, profoundly convinced of that. There's nothing can alter that. Nothing can take that from me. No matter how stormy the sea, how dark the night, there's nothing can take that from me.
So you feel that you felt changed after that in a way that has kind of continued on and grown? Has it helped you to grow? And were you able to grow with that church after having that experience with them? Did you bond with some of the people there, or did it take you somewhere else?
Yeah, there was wonderful times of fellowship.
You mentioned going to a dance, and
I boldly presented up in front of the congregation because I several times in my life, well, a few times, because no more than 3, I've actually recruited my own replacement at my job, not having another job that I'm going to. And when I left that congregation, I recruited someone to take my place. And as I was leaving,
were you moving the area?
Yeah, I was leaving again the area, and I would say I was a budding Christian fellow. I was single. I was going to be with family again for whatever curious reason that was. I think the attraction, my life has been very, very, very rich, but not wealthy. And by that I mean my time with loved ones and my relationship and my ability. At that juncture, for whatever reason, I went and spent several months living at my grandmother's house with her in her late 80s, just the 2 of us in Canada. And that was a remarkable, remarkable time. And I don't know.
What did you learn
It's
from
hard to
her?
figure out. I can't ever figure it out.
Yeah.
God will, maybe when I get to heaven, God will tell me.
I know we're getting close to the end. I wish we had more time, but
Right.
tell us really quick. I know that you are an incredible artist, and we didn't get to talk about that. But tell us really quick about your art.
Well, art is about being, like telling a story of one's life. It's about how different things are, and it's about how the same things are. It's both at once. I hope somebody listening to me will say, well, that's really radical. I would never hitchhike across country. And at the same time, in listening to what I've talked about, will say, he just put into words what I've been feeling. Because we are God's kids, each and every one of us. And so through my art, I seek to do things that are provocative sometimes, to provoke curiosity. I seek to do things that will allow the viewer to wonder, where does that come from? And I think sometimes maybe surprise them to say, he's a follower of Jesus Christ? That guy's a Christian that did that artwork? Because we're not meant to be silent. We're meant to be bold, and bold proclaimers of who he is and what Jesus Christ means.
Well, if only we can all be so bold. Thank
Amen.
you so much for telling us all of your story, and I wish we had time to dive in and hear even more. Thank you so much for being here, Carl.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us and for listening, and please join us again on Why We Are Christians.